You guys know the drill. I show you one good deck and I tell you how to play it. But let's ratchet it up a little bit. Let's go from 1 to 15 decks. You know what it is? It's the Meta Snapshot. Let's get through a few disclaimers before we get into this. First, this is not a tier list. I am not going to be ranking these decks as some people do in a tier list because it is simply too early in the new meta and a post-nerf world in TEPPEN for us to do that. Instead, what I wanted to show you was a comprehensive, as thorough of a look as I can at all of the decks that are being played and have somewhat of a proven record of success. That's what is going to land a deck on this list. It's not going to include everything that is out there being played because that is just not possible. And one other note, I'm not going to be including QR codes for these decks because it would just take entirely too long. But what I would encourage you to do is if one of these decks interests you, just hit the pause button. Let's begin with Ryu. Ryu's in a really good spot right now, and that is despite his two most popular hero arts being Shinku Hadouken and Denjin Renki getting nerfed within this year. Shinku, even at 20 AP for 7 damage on a specific unit, is still really good. And Denjin was adjusted. Some people perceived it as a nerf, but I think it kind of toes the line a little bit in terms of what it can do. Now, before we get to Denjin, let's talk about Shinku, and the build that is making the most waves right now definitely has to be the zombie variant. One of the biggest pioneers of this deck definitely has to be Kyle P, one of the best TEPPEN players in the United States. So a lot of these cards are going to look familiar. This type of a deck has been around for a while, and there's a few different variants, some of them using Nergigante, but Hadouken is definitely the more popular choice right now. This still makes use of Mega Tortoise, which is the unit that deals damage when other units on your field die. Now, Hatred Reborn does not have a place here anymore since it was nerfed because it now seals units when they come back. And let's be frank here, Junie coming back or Gate coming back sealed just wouldn't be good for anybody. So some of these lists have started to add Alfred Ashford, who when he dies destroys a unit that is 3 MP or less. This also has some other staples like Chain of Fists, Liberating Slash, Agent's Memories, Mad Massacre, Conspirator's Speech, all of these things to be able to deal damage in a bit of an indirect way. A Jewel is here because a Jewel is really good. And then you've got, in this particular list, one copy of Possessing Malice, and then of course Sigma, who has a ton of value in the form of Infinite Revenge. This shell can do really well in a lot of matchups. It's got a lot of stopping power, and it's not just in the early game. The fact that the majority of this deck is very cheap, there's nothing exceeding 4 MP cost here, allows you to really flood the board in a quick way. It's got some MP boosting in the form of Zombie and Junie. I think this is definitely a deck to watch and, a worthy contender if you were looking for something to not just climb to champion, but to climb into the high ranks. Denjin will definitely still have a presence in this meta. This is the deck that revolves around dealing a lot of direct damage to your opponent's hero, trying to avoid the unit scuffle. At least that's the way that it was. So Denjin was recently changed to be cheaper in order to be able to cast it, but it also applies less of a damage effect. So some people are perceiving it as a nerf, but you can use it more often to put that bonus damage on more cards, and some people are getting mileage out of it. This deck comes to us from Salty Joey. He's always hanging out in the Twitch streams and popping in the YouTube comments. He's a pretty good player, and he shared this list with me. A lot of these things, you've seen around before. Ashley Graham, she was still recently nerfed, getting a little more expensive, but she's still good in terms of buffing the deck's ability to do damage. Chain of Fists, Sneak Attack, Agent's Memories. You've got Leon Kennedy here. It was kind of a crappier version of Ashley, but he is cheaper. Scar of Humiliation, Headshot, Barrel Bomb, those are all direct damage. And then you've got some other big hitters in the terms of these red cards. Veteran Agent Leon is fantastic here. Lucia, I haven't tried this deck myself. You could probably put something else in her position. I think sometimes she can be a little lackluster, but Fate Defying Ryu, Magro Dragoon, definitely good choices here, as well as Trump Card, even though that now costs 2 MP more than it used to. A lot of people were really calling for Denjin to get nerfed, and there was a couple of changes, but in reality, I don't really know if it's going to be enough to kind of push Denjin out of its, the position that it held. I'm not necessarily saying this is a tier 1 deck, and why would I? This is not a tier list, but this deck is certainly capable. Rathalos' best hero art is Blazing Wall, and there's a few different decks that can make use of it. Blazing Wall is 14 AP to give some bonus HP and a shield to 1 unit of your choosing. But a lot of decks that kind of work well with this hero art also work well with Felyne. Now, which one of those is better? We'll talk about that when we actually get down to Felyne. So there's a couple of ways you could go about this. Any of the red and green shells that focus on the ever so talked about and controversial Valstrax unit. But there's some other ways you can go about this too. In fact, I saw a really interesting list that I played around with a little bit, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. So this list comes from KG Maeda from the TEPPEN community Discord. He said he had a 70% win rate within the last 20 matches that he played with it, and this was earlier this week. But I think the proof of concept is definitely there, and when I played it, you can definitely understand why this deck can put some major pressure on your opponent. So there's some unorthodox choices here. Guy for sure, Overdrive Ostrich absolutely, Furious Salvo, there's some things that you don't really see all that often. But what this deck does really well is applying immense amounts of pressure. Furious Salvo deals spread damage with a bonus if you have a unit out there that has Rush, and Guy, BB Hood, Overdrive Ostrich with the memory threshold, Valstrax, Fate Defying Ryu, they all have that. So there's a lot of ways that you can make use of that bonus. Now, a lot of these other things are staples that you've seen around here before. Chain of Fists, Liberating Slash, Trust Amid Suspicion, for direct damage, Rescuer's Bullet, which allows you to pull one of your units back into your EX pocket and deal some damage. You've also got Sheva here, who is one of the newer units, and then the legendary Lady, who is absolutely fantastic, not just in this deck, but in any deck that builds on the synergy of humans. In my mind, the only questionable choice here could possibly be the Desperate Betrayal and the Dread King Rathalos. You could make some substitutions there. I think this could probably benefit from a third Valstrax, and that's just because Valstrax is going to be very influential in this upcoming meta. Valstrax is going to be present in a lot of decks, and because of that, much like we saw with the Yawn effect in January, many decks are going to be shaped in a way of how can they keep Valstrax from doing his job. So it's just something to keep in mind going forward. But as I mentioned before, the red-green shell that works well with Felyne can work here as well. But this was just a unique deck that I thought had a proven track record of success and was worth showing to you. I had a lot of fun playing it. Jill is kind of where she's always been. Antibody activation decks, I think, are very difficult to pilot, especially to do it well. She's arguably the most difficult hero to pilot in the entire game, so that kind of results in a reduction of popularity, but there are some great players who are making good strides with her. Now, the only real answer in terms of a hero art is antibody activation, which gives bonus stats and a shield for 15 AP, but the kicker is you have to explore 3 times before you can activate that effect, and sometimes that can be difficult to do. So naturally, a Jill deck is going to be pigeonholed to including some of the explore elements. Now, this has changed over the last several months, and this is one of the more recent builds I could find in terms of Jill. A lot of this stuff you've seen before, the Bashin Ryu Awakening to proc those explorers. You've got Claire Redfield, who if you've explored 3 times, she deals 6 damage to the unit in front of her. Hellbat explores for detonations, Carlos explores for shields, and then you have Nash, who gains a ton of bonus stats and becomes an absolute monster. Gendrome also explores for little baby versions of himself, so he can be quite useful. Lucia can fit well with Jill, and that's because antibody activation is a decent way to protect her, and plus the number of actions that are in a standard Jill deck will allow you plenty of opportunities to resonate her into her transformed version, which is a lot more effective than her normal version. Absolutely. Cody is here to deal some extra damage. You know, you got one copy of Rescuer's Bullet. Leon's here. Fate Defying Ryu is here. You know, Jill is probably going to float where she's been previously, which is kind of middle of the road in terms of, you know, an actual tier list if we were going to construct one. But I do think that a player with really tight reaction times and good decision making can go very, very far with Jill. Jill can be really scary in the right hands. The only caveat is it's not easy to create those results. X is dead. You guys already knew this. Charge Shot got nerfed in a serious way. In my opinion, it was far too heavy-handed because that was really X's only presence in terms of, you know, a competitive deck that can climb not just to champion, but beyond, you know, the lower ranks of champion. And that's unfortunate because X really hasn't had any opportunity to shine up until Haunted by Memories came out. Now it feels like he's going to fall by the wayside again. So I really struggled to produce something for you guys that's current because I just haven't seen a whole lot of that stuff out there. I know Thirsty Games has been playing with X. I know Iowa has been too. They're both good streamers, talented players, also members of the EX podcast. So I really wish I had something super solid I could show you guys. What I'm going to instead show you is an older version of, you know, what Charge Shot used to be. Now, at its increased AP cost, Charge Shot is going to be a little bit slower in terms of its snowball effect, but I still think that you could find something that might be okay, and maybe one of you guys can draw inspiration from this list. You know, the X unit got nerfed. He only resonates HP on other units, not himself. You know, you've got Gammoth there, Iris has always been around, Layer is there, and a lot of the green staples that allow you to put more HP on those units so that they get stronger. I definitely think this deck needs some form of anti-air because I do think the flight aspect of Valstrax is going to be difficult to overcome, even with 2 disarms. I just feel like you need something maybe a little more reliable. Now you do have Lightning Rod there, which removes flight, so maybe that's enough. But maybe you would, you know, want to consider running maybe 1 copy of Leap in here. I don't know. I'm not an X expert by any means. I just wanted to be able to provide you guys with something. It's just really sad, you know, X's current state of affairs. So Chun-Li was really popular in January leading up to March because of how powerful Yawn was. Yawn is the hero art that puts a buff on a unit that says whenever it leaves the field, you're going to get +4 MP. Now it was just 15 AP, which allowed for some really crazy Ascension combos and some Swarm that was too difficult to overcome. Now that got toned down in March and Chun kind of fell off the radar, but Green's in a pretty good position right now, and some people are making strides with Yawn, kind of using the Trinity build that some of you may have heard of, and I'm going to show it to you right now. So they call it Trinity for the legendary there, the 6-cost legendary. And what that does is for the number of tribes that are present on the field, your units will get bonus stats. So this deck kind of relies on, you know, being able to throw out those new epic Neros that can benefit from having as many tribes on the field as possible. So you don't really have to worry about tribal synergy here. That's not really the name of the game. You do want to make sure that your tribes are spread out in a meaningful way. So you have the new Felyne here and the old Felyne here, Layer for MP generation. Got some staples, wall jump for the shield, disarm to seal, evasive action to reset stats. Those have been around for a while. Rikuo and Rainy Turtloid are 2 really good Ascension units that can still get some work done in this deck in particular. Hoitzel as well, even though Hoitzel was nerfed, he's still really good, especially for the anti-air options, which is one way to stop Valstrax. We already talked about the good Nero and why he is good. Definitely the best form of Nero possible. And then you have Natural Cycle there, which is an interesting tech choice and can allow you to kind of extend the lifeblood of this deck and make it last a little bit longer. Plus, it's also really neat to sneak it in there up against something like Living Death or some other cheese like that if you're in a tight spot. So this deck can do, I've got to assume just by looking at the deck as a whole, I think it can do well. I haven't played this one myself, but for Chun-Li players, this is definitely something to look to. Speaking of Nero, growth is making a bit of a comeback in the form of True Power, which allows for 1 free level up on a growth unit. Now, the only real new growth unit that is present from the new set is Sasquatch, but he can provide some value, especially because True Power allows for a free level up, even though normally it would require growth 7. So this is a deck that I found that some people have been posting about in the Nero channel of the Discord. So some of these cards, are definitely older. The Rebecca Chambers hasn't really been popular for a while. Neither is Basarios, G to a lesser extent, and Desert Tyrant Diablos. These were really, really good growth units that were really popular when that expansion came out late last year. The new Sasquatch is here, and whenever he levels up, he gives all of your units on the field bonus stats, which if you can do it for free off of True Power for just 12 AP, that's really, really good. The legendary Felyne here can get quite a bit of value in terms of the MP boost, running a couple of other copies of Felyne here. You've got Battle at the Summit, the Doll's Memories, which fits into a lot of different things. You also have Ivy Trap Teamwork, which is a new card that allows you to seal a unit of your choosing. It doesn't just have to be an opponent's unit. It can be anybody's unit, and it also has stat resets in there. So this deck is really, really interesting, and I think it can really hold up well against those decks, particularly red decks, that focus on dealing spread damage to your opponent. We haven't gotten to a ton of those yet, particularly the decks that focus on humans, but I do think having high HP totals can be beneficial here. The only, the major caveat here is you don't have a ton of anti-air. You've got the seals, and then you have Kanin, which is also another seal, and maybe you won't need it. I haven't tested this deck myself, but it's definitely on my list of one of the ones that I want to play because this looks super interesting. Felyne is definitely a contender for the best hero art in the game. He's actually got 2 that are really, really good, and we're going to talk about both of them. So the first one is Shield Spire, which is 14 AP to give 1 unit some bonus HP and a damage reduction effect. Some people call it the Besieged effect because that action, the green action, I should say, gives the same effect, which says any damage in the range of 1 to 3 is reduced to 1. This can be really, really powerful, especially because it is so cheap. So some people have been using Shield Spire with the Trinity build, a similar Trinity build that I showed you guys earlier, but definitely the most popular is the red and green variant that focuses on rushing your opponent down, dealing some damage, and creating obstacles that are too difficult for a lot of decks to overcome. So this is that deck. It was popularized by a Japanese player who got rank 3 with it last season, which I think is a great testament to what this deck can do. Some cards in here are ones that we've already talked about before, specifically Valstrax. You've got multiple shields in here. You also have the 3-cost Yawn monster down there that's 2/5 that has agility as well. You also have Inborn Powers, which gives bonus stats, allows a unit to move from its board slot to another one, and then also give you some extra MP generation if you hit the memory threshold. I've been playing with this deck this week, and I can tell you that it is an absolute monster, and not just because one person was able to pilot it so well to get rank 3. This deck is super fast, and I think that this deck will be a huge motivating factor that could eventually push Gung Ho to balance adjust Valstrax in some way. I'm being 100% serious about it. I think this deck is absolutely crazy, and if you haven't played it yourself and you like to be in your opponent's face, which is the playstyle that I like, you should definitely check this out. I mentioned the Trinity build before. It definitely works with Felyne, with Shield Spire. Here is an example of that. You know, a lot of these cards we've already talked about before, you know, so this deck can prove to be very, very powerful. So I just wanted to show you guys this one briefly, even though it's popped up multiple times already, or at least subtle variants to it. The last thing I want to talk about is Choral Orchestra, which is Felyne's hero art that reduces the MP cost of whatever tribe is being affected by the hero art itself. So this hero art is a little tricky, but it has a lot of potential. Now, the initial thought on this hero art was that humans will make the most out of Choral Orchestra, and I'm still a believer in that. I talked about humans a little bit when the expansion first came out, but that list I shared with you guys could definitely use some tweaking. So here's an updated version of Choral Orchestra with humans. Now, you know, you've got Bombast, which allows you to search for humans and reduce their cost. You know, this deck will eventually, you know, the longer a game goes, as long as you are playing well, this deck will eventually allow you to swarm your opponent with humans to the point where, as long as you still have cards left, there's not really going to be anything that they can do about it. This deck was a little sluggish before the nerf because it just couldn't compete as well with some other decks like Zero, Exodia. But now that some of those decks are a little more in line with the rest of the cast, humans are definitely going to speed up. So I definitely think they are something to look at. Definitely. Morrigan's in a tricky spot because she's just not as good as Zero. So most people that are trying to pioneer new purple decks are doing it with Zero instead of Morrigan. So anything that I could show you with Morrigan would be better served under Zero. So instead of just showing you something specific for this hero, I'm just gonna move on. Before we get to Zero, let's talk about Dante. There's really only one deck that is making waves with Dante because he, for the most part, also pales in comparison to Zero, but there is one deck that he does well that Zero cannot, and that is the dreaded red and purple burn deck. I hesitate to show this to you guys, but some of you I'm sure have already seen it before, so let's take a look. You can probably guess at what this deck is meant to do, and that is to stall your opponent out and burn them down with direct damage to the hero. Trump card, sneak attack, scar of humiliation, headshot, barrel bomb. We've talked about these before, as well as agent's memories, which are allowing you to deal that extra damage. One copy of Valstrax here could potentially allow you to close out a match if you need a unit, but it's the only unit in here. Foresight, loss of meaning to draw the cards that you need. You know, you've got Maverick's Memories here for the counter, unforeseen interference. Now, Exposed Evil Eye, you know, this is a deck list that was pre-nerf, so Exposed Evil Eye could possibly go because it's not nearly as effective as it used to be, you know, in terms of the increased cost. So you could probably make some substitutions here. Monstrous Virus definitely helps because it's going to give you that extra 30 seconds to close out a match if you need it. I do think that this deck is obnoxious. I think that this type of playstyle, it doesn't really fit with, and I know that this is, you know, my opinion, but kind of what I've always come to expect from TEPPEN since the game came out, which was a lot of unit interaction sprinkled in with some actions as well. This kind of goes against that philosophy. But if you want to play Dante and you like burn, if you're one of those people, this is something you can look to. So Zero's been nerfed, yay. Rakoha now costs a lot more AP to cast than it used to. So that is definitely going to slow down the potential of the ever popular and, you know, somewhat controversial Exodia Zero deck. This is the deck that relied on a bunch of cheap actions to stall your opponent out into something big, oftentimes like X-Hunters or something along those lines. Now, some of the cards in that deck, Exposed Evil Eye, you know, has been nerfed like we just mentioned before. V has been nerfed. V is the unit that I've talked about in several recent videos that generates his familiars at a very cheap cost. But now that he's 10 MP, that's a lot more difficult to do. So Exodia Zero is going to become, in my opinion, a little bit less popular, but I still think it's going to be around because even at Rakoha's increased AP cost, it's not all that bad. Some people have been pioneering a little bit of a different strategy for Zero, and that is using Resonate. I know that Horrible Chopstick was playing Resonate with Morrigan specifically, but this is a zero version using Fight Against Inner Demons, which definitely looks a lot better now that Rakoha is a little toned down. And Fight Against Inner Demons has always been pretty good, but the RNG elements of whether or not you're going to get the destroy action or the buff action is what kind of holds it back. So this is an updated version of Resonate. Now your Resonate units here are Hashenko and you have Ibuki, but you've also put some other ones in here. You have V in here as well. You've got X Hunters in here. You've got Jury just in case. You know, the big purple staples are here, sprinkled in with a few other things to allow you to buff up those units, because Ibuki and Hashenko in most games are going to be your big damage dealers. I'm not totally convinced that this deck is going to be top tier or anything. If anything, it's probably going to be maybe a little above middle of the pack in terms of the decks and the heroes that are in TEPPEN. But, you know, it's something you could consider. If you like playing Resonate, if that was your jam back in the day, then you should give this a shot. By nature of a lot of unit heavy decks becoming more popular, specifically with red and green, that means there will be a rise from mono black decks, and that is because they have so much removal. So we will start with this discussion at Wesker. Now there's a couple of different variants that are floating around. One of them I think is a lot better than the other. So let's just look at a straight version of Dark Destruction. Now this comes from Iowa. This is a build that he shared, and a lot of this is, you know, none of these cards are particularly earth-shattering. We've seen builds like this before. You know, Mad Massacre, Selfish Predation, allowing you to get rid of your own units, one for damage, one for a little bit of HP. Zombie, Junie, you don't really care if they go away because you get their benefits whenever they die. Sigma is here, we've talked about him before. Fate of the Unworthy, one of the most overtuned cards in the game, which somehow manages to escape the nerf bat every single time since it came out in January. Allows you to pop an unascended unit and deal 1 damage. A little slap in the face on top of that. Alexia Ashford is another really good card. Whenever she ascends, she destroys a unit with 5 MP or less. So, you know, you can get lots and lots of value out of her. Obliteration is another destruction. Cruel Game allows you to clear or potentially even out the board. Now, even though Hatred Reborn got nerfed, it's still not necessarily the worst thing in the world to get some value, because you're only paying 2 to potentially get a 3-cost body out of it. So even though it's not, you know, perfect, it's not as good as it used to be, there's still good value there. And I think, you know, just Dark Destruction in general, being able to scoop a 5 MP or less monster and just get rid of it, I think there's a lot of value there. So the more popular that these red and green decks become, the more I would expect to see decks like this. The, in my opinion, less effective version of Wesker is the self-mill deck that became popular with the new expansion. Sure, this deck can operate quickly in some situations, but at the end of the day, a standard Dark Destruction, at least in the way the meta is shaping up, is going to get you a lot further. So what this deck does, it relies on a bunch of new cards to thin out your deck to a certain point, to where you are getting your revenge units almost guaranteed, and you're also able to get the benefits of having a really low cost deck. That includes Executioner Majini, who is the new epic unit down there at the bottom next to Rebels Memories. This deck can work. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to climb with it. I just think that a more conventional Dark Destruction is going to get you further, at least in the way the meta is shaping up. Nergigante is still pretty good, and that's because Spike Dive Bomb is pretty good. It's just 15 AP to give one of your units +4/+4, but whenever it makes its next attack, it self-destructs. Luckily for you, there are a lot of units that actually are better off if they kick the bucket. So there's a couple of ways you can go about this. Narikawa Games recently did a showcase of a really interesting flight build that focuses around Spike Dive Bomb. I do think that deck can be really scary, and I'm going to give full credit to Narikawa for this deck. This is where I initially saw it. I haven't played it myself, but it's on my bucket list of decks that I certainly want to try. Now, one that I have tried is something that I've mentioned in a lot of my most recent videos talking about the balance changes, and that is using Bamboo Pandemonium. So this is a 3-cost 4/8 that gives reduced MP generation whenever he's on the field. So he's got a big body, but he's also got a big drawback. So the best way to get around that is to seal this guy. And now with the way that Hatred Reborn works, as well as Warped Reality Instinct, you can get this guy back when he is sealed. So this is one variation of the deck that I've seen posted. I think this was from Dark Void, but I could be incorrect. A lot of people have been playing around with this Panda deck. In my opinion, I don't think it's that great. I still think it's a little sluggish in terms of its output. But you know, I think that there's definitely some cards in here you can get mileage out of. I really wouldn't recommend trying to build a deck just around Pandemonium. I do think that that will create problems for you. You know, some people have theorized that the Turbo Cami deck, but substituting Bamboo, could be, you know, a nice workaround, and from my own testing, it's really not. So this is something that you could consider. It is a green and black variant that's got some self buffs in here, some MP generation. Could be enough to swarm. Haven't tried this one myself either, but something to consider. The last deck I want to talk about is for Akuma, and that is Raging Demon. So I mentioned before how mono black is just going to become more popular because of, you know, the popularity of these red and green decks that I think are only going to get more popular. That's my prediction for this meta. So Raging Demon having a lot of destroy effects, which, you know, it doesn't matter what a unit's stats are. If you could just destroy it, then all of those buffs or whatever it is were applied to it are totally wasted. So Raging Demon definitely has potential. And here's a list that I have seen floating around on the Discord. A lot of this is, you know, it really similar to what Raging Demon has been before. This is kind of the conventional build. So you got Selfish Predation to give yourself some HP back. You got Hatred Reborn, which isn't as great, you know, in a post-nerf world, but like I mentioned before, been looking at the Wesker deck, you know, paying 2 for a 3-cost for the body can be decent. So you've got Alfred Ashford and Junie, who we've talked about before. You have the Ascension version of Gate here. And you also have a Jewel and Alexia Ashford, who are going to be your Raging Demon targets, which Raging Demon, when applied, ascends a unit and then destroys the unit in front of it. You've also got Seth, who, you know, if you've ascended a certain amount of times, can get rid of a unit on your opponent's field. The rest of these cards we've already talked about before. I do think that, you know, like I mentioned before, the more popular unit-based decks get, the better this matchup will be for you. And that's my meta snapshot for TEPPEN in August of 2020. Like I mentioned before, I'm going to take all of these lists, put them in a nice little album. It'll be in the description if you want to go and look at them a little bit more. Also, full credit to all the amazing creators on the TEPPEN community Discord. Everybody's super awesome and always willing to talk deck tech. So if you are not already involved in that place, you should definitely go do that. And if you want more TEPPEN content, subscribing and liking this video is the best way to let me know. I love you guys. Wear your masks, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.